April 15th, 1986. 4:38 a.m. local time. A slick of jet fuel spreads across the Gulf of Sidra, catching the first gray light off the Libyan coast. Bits of aluminum and composite material bob in the Mediterranean chop. Wing fragments, shattered avionics panels, the kind of debris that tells you something came apart fast. Somewhere below, in water too deep and too contested to search properly, an F-111F rests on the seafloor. Tail number 7038. Its crew, Captain Fernando Ribas Dominici and Captain Paul Lawrence, are gone. They'd been in the air for almost 14 hours by then. Nobody on the strike package saw them go in. The other aircraft were already pulling off target, running north at low altitude, engines in mill power, jamming pods screaming. In the chaos of egress, with SAMs still tracking and AAA still arcing over Tripoli, one missing jet doesn't register immediately. You count noses when you're safe. They counted noses over the Mediterranean, and the math came up short. One aircraft, two men. The full price of admission. What they'd pulled off in the preceding 6 minutes, the strike itself, would reshape how the United States projected power for a generation. But that comes later. Right now, at dawn on April 15th, the story is wreckage and fuel and silence on a radio frequency where two voices should have been. So how did an American tactical bomber end up dying 6,400 miles from its home base in England over a coastline it had never trained to hit on a mission planned in 11 days? The full answer involves Muammar Gaddafi, a Berlin discotheque, French diplomatic stubbornness, and the most audacious long-range strike since the Doolittle raid. Most of that story gets reduced to a paragraph in Cold War timelines. There's a lot more to it than that. If you're the kind of person who wants the full version, hit subscribe now, leave a like, and drop what you know about El Dorado Canyon in the comments. Some of you have details I haven't found, but start with the airplane. The General Dynamics F-111. They called it the Aardvark, which is about the least glamorous name you can hang on a supersonic strike aircraft. It looked the part, too. Long drooping nose, side-by-side cockpit, variable sweep wings that could tuck back against the fuselage for high-speed runs at treetop altitude. The thing was not pretty. It was never supposed to be. The F-111 was designed in the early 1960s to do one job: fly below radar coverage in the dark, in bad weather, find a target, and kill it. Then leave before anyone figured out what happened. The design had a rough adolescence. Early models suffered structural failures. Wing pivot fittings cracked. Several crashed during combat evaluation in Vietnam in 1968. 3 lost in just a few weeks, which nearly killed the entire program. McNamara's Pentagon had forced the Air Force and Navy to share the airframe, a decision both services hated, and the Navy eventually walked away from their version entirely. The whole project looked like a procurement disaster, but the Air Force kept at it. They fixed the wing boxes, upgraded the avionics, and by the late 70s, the F-111F variant carried a PEV-TAC infrared targeting pod that could find a tank in the dark from miles away and guide a laser-guided bomb straight through its roof. The jet that nearly died in procurement ended up owning the night attack mission across the Western Alliance. And in April 1986, Ronald Reagan needed exactly that. 229 wounded, 3 dead. 2 of them American servicemen, Sergeant Kenneth Ford and Sergeant James Goins. The third was a Turkish woman. April 5th, 1986, 1:49 a.m., West Berlin. A bomb packed with Semtex and shrapnel detonated inside La Belle Discotheque on Hauptstrasse, a club popular with off-duty GIs from the American garrison. The blast tore through the dance floor. Within hours, German police had the scene cordoned off and the wounded distributed across West Berlin hospitals. Within days, the diplomatic machinery started grinding. But the Reagan administration already knew something the public didn't, and something Gaddafi assumed nobody could prove. The National Security Agency had been reading Libyan diplomatic traffic. Not all of it, but enough. East Berlin's Libyan People's Bureau, their embassy essentially, had been communicating with Tripoli before and after the attack using channels the NSA had compromised. The intercepts were specific. On April 4th, the day before the bombing, a cable from Tripoli to East Berlin ordered an attack against Americans. The language was direct. After the bomb went off, a second message went back to Libya, reporting that the operation had been carried out successfully. The East Berlin Bureau called it a joyous event. Those are their words. Reagan's intelligence briefers laid the cable transcripts on his desk. The evidence chain was about as clean as signals intelligence gets: tasking from Tripoli, confirmation from the field, celebration afterward. There was no plausible deniability. Gaddafi had ordered the murder of American soldiers on a dance floor in a divided city, and the United States had the receipts. This wasn't the first time Libya had pushed. Gaddafi had been sponsoring terrorism across Europe and the Middle East for years, funding the IRA, backing Palestinian splinter groups, running assassination operations against Libyan dissidents in London and Rome, funneling money and weapons to anyone willing to destabilize the West. The previous December, simultaneous attacks at the Rome and Vienna airports killed 19 people, including 5 Americans. U.S. intelligence linked those to a Palestinian faction operating under Libyan patronage. The pattern was old. What changed after Labelle was the proof. Intercepted communications, time-stamped, routed through known Libyan intelligence channels, explicitly connecting Tripoli to the attack. The kind of evidence that survives a cabinet debate. Reagan had already been signaling escalation. In March, the Navy had deliberately sailed carrier battle groups into the Gulf of Sidra, crossing Gaddafi's self-declared line of death at 32 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. The Libyans responded by firing SA-5 surface-to-air missiles at American aircraft. The Navy sank 2 Libyan patrol boats and hit a radar installation at Sirte with harm anti-radiation. Missiles. Gaddafi didn't back down. He doubled down. So now the president had dead Americans and ironclad signals intelligence, facing a dictator who read restraint as weakness. The National Security Council met. The Joint Chiefs presented options. The question wasn't whether to strike Libya. The question was how to get there. Gaddafi drew the line on a map in 1973. Literally drew it, a straight boundary across the Gulf of Sidra at 32 degrees 30 minutes north, claiming everything south of it as Libyan territorial waters. International law recognized 12 nautical miles from shore. Gaddafi claimed roughly 150 miles of open Mediterranean. The entire Gulf, essentially. He announced that any foreign military vessel or aircraft crossing south of this line would be destroyed. Nobody in Washington took it seriously at first. The claim had no basis in maritime law, no precedent, and no enforcement mechanism beyond Gaddafi's own air force and a collection of Soviet-supplied patrol boats. The U.S. Sixth Fleet had been operating in the central Mediterranean since the 1940s. The Gulf was international water by every recognized standard. But Gaddafi wasn't making a legal argument. He was making a political one. Every day that American ships stayed north of his imaginary boundary, his credibility grew. Every year that passed without a challenge, the line hardened from absurdity into something approaching fact, at least in the minds of the non-aligned nations Gaddafi was courting. He understood theater. The man wore military uniforms he'd designed himself, traveled with a personal guard of women soldiers, pitched a Bedouin tent at diplomatic summits, delivered 4-hour speeches at the UN General Assembly. Subtlety was not the operating principle. Through the late 70s, Libya became the world's most reliable sponsor of political violence. The shopping list is long. Gaddafi bankrolled the Abu Nidal organization, which carried out attacks in over 20 countries. He supplied arms to the Provisional IRA. He funded separatist movements in the Philippines, Chad, and across sub-Saharan Africa. Libyan agents assassinated dissidents on the streets of European capitals. 11 Libyan exiles killed in 1980 alone. Gunned down in London, Bonn, Milan, Athens. In April 1984, someone inside the Libyan People's Bureau in London fired a Sterling submachine gun from a first-floor window into a crowd of anti-Gaddafi protesters. A police constable named Yvonne Fletcher fell dead on the sidewalk. She was 25. The British severed diplomatic relations. Libya faced no military consequences. That was the pattern. Provocation, outrage, diplomatic response, no kinetic follow-through. Gaddafi absorbed sanctions the way a sponge absorbs water. The structure doesn't change. The Reagan administration broke the cycle gradually. In August 1981, the Navy ran freedom of navigation exercises directly across the line of death. Two Libyan Su-22 fitters scrambled to intercept. They fired on a pair of F-14 Tomcats from the carrier Nimitz. The Tomcat crews, Commander Hank Kleeman and Lieutenant Dave Venlet in one jet, Lieutenant Larry Mazinski and Lieutenant Jim Anderson in the other, shot both fitters down over the Gulf in about 60 seconds. It was the first American aerial engagement since Vietnam, and it happened because Gaddafi's pilots were either brave or poorly briefed. Probably both. The Sidra shootdown should have recalibrated Gaddafi's risk assessment. It didn't. Libyan-sponsored terrorism actually increased through the mid-80s. The Rome and Vienna airport massacres in December 85. The La Belle bombing in April 86. The attacks kept getting bolder, kept landing closer to American personnel. Gaddafi operated on a theory that the United States, still gun-shy from Vietnam, still entangled in Cold War caution about Soviet client states, would never strike the Libyan homeland directly. For 13 years, he'd been right. The decision took less than a week. Reagan signed the execute order on April 14th. National Security Advisor John Poindexter carried the final strike plan into the Situation Room, and the president approved it without extended debate. The targets were already selected: 5 sites across Tripoli and Benghazi, military facilities linked directly to Libya's terrorist infrastructure. Gaddafi's Bab al-Azizia compound was on the list. So was the Sidi Bilal Naval Commando School, the Tripoli military airfield, the Benina airfield near Benghazi, and the Jamahiriya barracks. The plan called for a simultaneous strike from 2 directions: Navy A-6, intruders off carriers in the Mediterranean hitting Benghazi, and Air Force F-111s flying from RAF Lakenheath in England to hit Tripoli. From England to Libya and back, the straight-line distance is maybe 1,600 miles. A reasonable ask for a tactical bomber with aerial refueling. The F-111 could handle that geometry easily. South across France, over the western Mediterranean, turn left at Tunisia, and you're on the Libyan coast in under 4 hours. Washington asked France for overflight permission. François Mitterrand said no. The French refusal landed like a slap. Mitterrand cited concerns about escalation, about destabilizing North Africa, about the political optics of allowing American bombers to cross French airspace en route to bombing an Arab nation. The reasoning sounded diplomatic. In practice, it was logistical sabotage. Spain followed France's lead within hours. No overflight of Spanish territory either. Italy, which sat right across the Mediterranean from Libya, made similar noises about non-involvement. Of the major European allies, only Margaret Thatcher's Britain offered unconditional support. The Iron Lady didn't flinch. She authorized the use of British bases and British airspace without conditions, a decision that cost her politically at home and bought her permanent goodwill in Washington. So, what did the French refusal actually mean in operational terms? It meant the F-111s couldn't fly south. They had to fly west from England, then south through the gap between Portugal and the Azores, bank left along the African coast, thread the Strait of Gibraltar, still international airspace, and run the entire length of the Mediterranean to reach Tripoli from the west. The round trip ballooned to 6,400 miles, 13 hours of flight time, 4 aerial refuelings each way, minimum. Crews strapped into ejection seats for the duration, eating sandwiches from brown paper bags, urinating into piddle packs, maintaining radio silence across half the Atlantic. 28. KC-10 and KC-135 tankers would have to be staged along the route. The tanker plan alone required its own planning cell. The French added 2,600 miles to the mission. Mitterrand probably assumed that distance would kill it. He underestimated the wrong people. No other air force on the planet could have done it. That's not patriotism. That's arithmetic. 18 F-111Fs launched from Lakenheath. 6 F-111 Raven electronic warfare jets flew alongside from RAF Upper Hayford. 28 tankers, a mix of KC-10 extenders and KC-135 stratotankers, had to be positioned along the route in precisely choreographed orbits, at precise altitudes, at precise times, in radio silence, at night over open ocean. Every aircraft had to find its tanker in the dark using only navigation lights and onboard radar. A missed connection meant a jet turning back. 2 missed connections meant a gap in the strike package. The margin for error was essentially the width of a boom receptacle at 300 knots. Each F-111 needed 4 separate refuelings on the way to Libya and 3 or 4 on the return leg. That's roughly 140 individual aerial refueling events across a single night. Every one of them conducted in complete emissions silence. No radio calls, no IFF transponders, nothing that might alert Soviet intelligence trawlers monitoring NATO frequencies in the eastern Atlantic. The tankers flew racetrack patterns over the ocean west of Portugal, south of the Azores, in the western Mediterranean, and at a final set of coordinates east of Gibraltar. Some tankers refueled other tankers. The logistics chain folded back on itself like origami. You have to understand what aerial refueling actually demands of a pilot. The receiver aircraft closes to within about 20 feet of the tanker's belly, matching speed and altitude, while a boom operator threads a rigid pipe into a receptacle roughly 18 inches across. Turbulence from the tanker's engines buffets the receiver constantly. At night, over water, with no horizon reference, the spatial disorientation is severe. Now do that 4 times on the way to a combat mission where people are going to shoot at you, knowing you have to do it again 4 more times on the way home while exhausted. The F-111's cockpit is narrow. 2 crews sit side by side, pilot on the left, weapons systems officer on the right, in Martin Baker ejection seats that weren't designed for 13-hour occupancy. The British did something similar with their Vulcan bombers during the Falklands War in '82, Operation Black Buck, a single aircraft flying from Ascension Island to bomb Port Stanley Airfield. That mission required 11 tankers to get 1 bomber to the target. 1 bomber. The Americans were sending 24 strike and jamming aircraft on a route nearly twice as long, hitting 5 separate targets simultaneously and bringing everybody home through the same tanker gauntlet. The scale isn't comparable. The fuel math alone is staggering. A single F-111 burns roughly 8,000 pounds of JP4 per hour at cruise. 13 hours of flight time means over 100,000 pounds of fuel per aircraft, delivered across multiple mid-air hookups, multiplied by 24 jets. The tanker fleet had to carry and transfer something in the neighborhood of 2.4 million pounds of jet fuel over the course of the night. A KC-10 carries 356,000 pounds. A KC-135 carries about 200,000. The numbers only close if every tanker hits every rendezvous on schedule. Nobody has mechanical trouble. And the weather cooperates over 4,000 miles of ocean. The Soviets couldn't have done this. Their long-range aviation had Tupolev bombers with intercontinental range. But their tanker fleet was a fraction of America's size, and their crews had almost no experience with the kind of large formation, multi-point refueling choreography that SAC tanker crews practiced monthly. The French couldn't have done it, which is ironic given that their refusal created the problem. The RAF had proven with Black Buck that they understood the concept, but lacked the tanker inventory to scale it. Only the United States Air Force maintained the aircraft, the crews, the planning infrastructure, and the institutional habit of projecting tactical air power across oceanic distances on 72 hours' notice. General Charles Gabriel, the Air Force Chief of Staff, reportedly called the tanker plan the most complex aerial refueling operation in history. Nobody in the decades since has challenged that assessment. The smell hit the crews somewhere over the western Mediterranean. That particular blend of hydraulic fluid, sweat-damp Nomex, and stale oxygen that accumulates in a sealed cockpit after 8 hours. 12 aircraft were still in formation. 6 F-111Fs had turned back with mechanical problems or failed refueling contacts. The strike package that was supposed to be 18 bombers was now 12. Each abort widened the gaps in target coverage. The mission planning had accounted for attrition. Losing a third of your force before reaching the combat zone was within parameters, barely, but it meant fewer bombs on fewer aim points. Some crews would have to compensate. At 1:45 a.m. Tripoli time, the formation split. 9 F-111Fs continued toward Tripoli. 3 broke south toward the Tripoli military airfield at a lower altitude. The EF-111 Ravens pushed ahead to set up their jamming orbits. They'd begin flooding Libyan radar frequencies roughly 90 seconds before the bombers crossed the coast. Timing mattered down to fractions of a minute. The Navy strike had to hit Benghazi at the same instant the Air Force hit Tripoli. 2 carrier air wings, Coral Sea and America, had their own A-6 intruder packages inbound from the north, with F/A-18 Hornets running harm suppression against Benghazi's SA-5 batteries. 2 separate task forces from 2 separate services, hitting 2 separate target complexes at 1 synchronized time on target. 2 a.m. The F-111s dropped to 500 feet over the water. Wings swept back to 54 degrees for high-speed penetration. The paved tack infrared pods swung down from their cradles in the weapons bay, each pod housing a laser designator and a forward-looking infrared sensor that painted the world in shades of heat. The weapons systems officers in the right seats watched their screens fill with the thermal signature of a coastline. Buildings, roads, warm concrete along the Tripoli waterfront, and somewhere in that gray-white wash, Bab al-Azizia. The Libyan air defense network was extensive on paper. Soviet-supplied SA-2s, SA-3s, SA-6s, SA-8s, plus a dense belt of ZSU-23-4 radar-guided anti-aircraft guns around high-value sites. French-built Crudal short-range missiles guarded the airfields. On paper, Tripoli was one of the most heavily defended cities in North Africa. The Ravens tore into that network with everything they had. A LQ-99 jamming pods blanked entire radar bands. Chaff corridors bloomed across the sky. For about 45 seconds, Libyan radar operators saw static. Then the city lit up anyway. Gaddafi's air defense commanders did something the planners hadn't fully anticipated. They fired blind. Every anti-aircraft battery in the Tripoli defense zone opened up simultaneously, barrage style, filling predetermined volumes of sky with steel and high explosive. No radar guidance, no tracking, just walls of tracer fire and unguided SA-2s rippling off their launchers into the dark. The volume was extraordinary. Crews described it afterward as a solid curtain of light rising from the city. One pilot called it the densest flak he'd ever seen, and several of these men had fathers who'd flown over Hanoi. The bombers held their runs. Over Bab al-Azizia, weapons systems officers locked their paved tack lasers onto the compound's administrative buildings. GBU 10. Paveway 2's 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs released cleanly and rode the reflected laser energy down through the barrage fire. Flak didn't change the guidance solution. The bombs followed the reflected energy and hit what the laser painted. Multiple impacts were confirmed across the compound. At Sidi Bilal, the Naval Commando Training Facility took direct hits on its primary structures. At the Tripoli airfield, parked IL-76 transport aircraft burned on the ramp. Over Benghazi, the Navy's A-6 crews put their ordnance through the Benina airfield and the Jamahiriya barracks within the same 2-minute window. Harm missiles from the Hornets had already shredded 2 SA-5 radar vans. Both cities took simultaneous hits at 2 a.m. local, plus or minus about 30 seconds. The entire time over target for the Tripoli strike was roughly 12 minutes. 12 minutes after 13 hours of flying. The crews pulled off the coast, heading north, wings still swept, countermeasures still pumping, and began the long climb back to refueling altitude. Behind them, secondary explosions flickered across the Tripoli skyline. Ahead of them, another 13 hours, another 4-tanker rendezvous, and the growing question that nobody in the formation could answer yet. One aircraft hadn't checked in on the egress frequency. Remit 31, crewed by Captain Fernando Ribas Dominici and Captain Paul Lorentz, was missing somewhere over or near Tripoli. The formation couldn't circle back. The fuel didn't allow it. Karma 5-2, check in. Nothing. The call went out 3 times on the egress frequency. Standard procedure. Every aircraft checks in after clearing the target area, a verbal roll call that confirms the formation is intact. One by one, the call signs reported. Karma 5-2 never did. Captain Fernando Ribas Dominici was 23 years old, from Utuado, Puerto Rico. Captain Paul Lorentz was 31, from San Francisco. They'd been assigned the Bab al-Azizia target, Gaddafi's compound, the most heavily defended aim point in the entire strike package. The compound sat in the middle of Tripoli's densest concentration of anti-aircraft batteries. Every crew assigned to that target knew the geometry was ugly. Ribas Dominici was the pilot. Lawrence ran the PAVTAC system from the right seat. They'd made it through 4 aerial refuelings, 8 hours of overwater flight, and the initial penetration of Libyan airspace. Somewhere in the final seconds of their bomb run, or just after weapons release, their aircraft was hit. The details stay murky. Post-mission intelligence analysis suggested a combination of anti-aircraft artillery and possibly an SA-6 missile. But the wreckage was never recovered from Libyan territory, and Gaddafi's government had no interest in cooperating with American investigators. The Libyans eventually returned Ribas Dominici's remains in 1989. Lawrence's body was returned in the same year. Neither man ejected. There's an interesting but ultimately irrelevant detail buried in the mission records. Karma 5-2 was not the original call sign assigned to that crew. Call signs were shuffled during the planning phase for operational security reasons. The records don't say what the original designation was. What the records do say is that Ribas Dominici and Lawrence were the only American casualties of Operation El Dorado Canyon. 1 aircraft lost out of roughly 45 Navy and Air Force strike, jamming, and support aircraft that entered Libyan airspace that night. The Libyans fired over 100 surface-to-air missiles and uncountable rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition. They hit 1 airplane. The formation flew home without them. 13 more hours, 4 more refuelings. The crews landed at Lakenheath in the gray English morning, some of them having been awake for nearly 24 hours straight. Ground crews counted the returning jets on the ramp. 17 F-111s, 6 EF-111s. Every tanker accounted for. 1 parking spot stayed empty, and the wing's senior leadership already knew whose it was. A memorial would come eventually, and letters to families. Ribas Dominici was posthumously promoted to captain. He'd actually been a first lieutenant at the time of the mission, a detail that often gets lost. Lawrence held the rank printed in his obituary. But that morning, on the flight line, nobody was talking about promotions. They were counting airplanes. 6 of the 12 F-111Fs that reached Tripoli either aborted their bomb runs or failed to achieve accurate weapons delivery. Half. The number is uncomfortable, and the Air Force spent months afterward trying to explain it in classified after-action reports. Equipment malfunctions accounted for some: PAVTAC pods that couldn't lock, laser designators that drifted, navigation systems disagreeing with each other after 13 hours of accumulated drift error. Other crews simply couldn't positively identify their assigned aim points in the seconds available. The rules of engagement were explicit on this point. If you can't confirm the target on your infrared display, you don't drop. Several crews made that call. Given what happened with the bombs that did release off target, those crews made the right one. At least 2 sticks of bombs landed in the Bin Ashur residential neighborhood adjacent to Bab al-Azizia. 2,000-pound weapons don't discriminate between military compounds and apartment blocks. The blast radius of a single GBU-10 is roughly 400 feet, and the overpressure wave extends considerably further. Libyan government sources initially claimed over 100 civilian dead. Western intelligence estimates put the number lower, somewhere between 15 and 40 civilians killed in Tripoli, with the Bin Ashur impacts accounting for most of them. The French embassy, located about a kilometer from the Azizia compound, took blast damage and shrapnel through its windows. Nobody inside was killed, but the symbolism was almost too perfect. France denies overflight rights to protect its relationship with Libya, and American bombs shatter the embassy windows anyway. A French diplomat described the damage as considerable. The Israelis had faced a similar reckoning after their strike on the Osirak reactor in '81, a surgically successful mission that nonetheless drew universal condemnation, including from the Reagan administration itself. Precision in planning doesn't always survive contact with reality, and the political fallout from even a small number of civilian casualties can dwarf the military achievement that caused them. Gaddafi understood this instinctively. Within hours of the raid, Libyan state television was broadcasting footage of destroyed homes, injured children, wailing families picking through rubble. Western journalists, based in Tripoli, and there were several because Gaddafi had cultivated media relationships for exactly this kind of moment, were escorted to the damage sites. The cameras found what cameras always find: concrete dust on small faces, a child's shoe in the wreckage. Gaddafi himself appeared on television claiming his adopted daughter, Hana, had been killed in the bombing of his compound. He showed what he said was her body. Whether Hana Gaddafi actually died that night has been disputed for decades. Multiple intelligence sources later suggested she survived and lived under a different identity, and a woman matching her description surfaced during the 2011 Civil War. The records conflict on this, and not for lack of people trying to settle the question. What isn't disputed is the propaganda effect. Gaddafi presented himself to the Arab world and the non-aligned movement as a victim of American aggression, a father mourning his child. He was the leader of a small nation standing defiant against superpower brutality. The framing worked in the audiences it was designed for. Across North Africa, the Middle East, and much of the developing world, the raid was condemned as state terrorism. The UN General Assembly voted 179-0, with the United States abstaining rather than casting the lone dissent to condemn the attack. The Soviet Union called it barbarism. The non-aligned movement issued statements of solidarity with Libya that continued for months. The damage assessment told two stories depending on who was reading it. Pentagon briefers showed before and after satellite imagery of the Azizia compound, the Sidi Bilal training facility, the airfield wreckage. Clean hits. Military objectives destroyed. Libyan state media showed Bin Asher. Apartment buildings with their facades torn off. Rescue workers carrying stretchers. Reagan administration officials struggled with the dissonance. Secretary of State George Shultz maintained publicly that the operation had been carefully targeted and that civilian casualties were regrettable but limited. Privately, the after-action reviews acknowledged that the combination of equipment failures, compressed timelines, and the sheer difficulty of precision bombing at night from 500 feet while flying through barrage fire had produced results well short of what the planning had promised. The paved tack system was good. It wasn't perfect. And in a dense urban environment, the distance between good and perfect is measured in city blocks. Gaddafi appeared on Libyan state television at dawn, wearing a military uniform and sunglasses indoors. He was alive. He looked rattled but functional, and he spoke for nearly an hour about American cowardice, about the martyrdom of his daughter, about how the Libyan people would endure. The compound behind him was cratered. He broadcast from a tent pitched in the rubble, which was either real defiance or extraordinary stagecraft, probably both. How did he survive? The Italian intelligence service, SISMI, had maintained back-channel contacts with Tripoli for years. Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi later admitted publicly that Italy had warned Libya of the incoming strike. He framed it as a humanitarian gesture, an attempt to prevent casualties. The warning reportedly reached Gaddafi roughly 2 hours before the bombs fell. Enough time to leave the compound. Not enough time to relocate his air defense network or disperse his military assets, which is why the physical damage to installations was real. Even though the primary target, Gaddafi himself, though the Reagan administration never officially acknowledged he was a target, was sleeping somewhere else when the GBU-10s came through the roof. An Italian NATO ally using intelligence gained through alliance channels, tipping off the man American pilots were risking their lives to kill. Craxi faced no formal consequences for this. The Reagan administration was furious but said nothing publicly. Alliance politics, as always. So, the strategic objective failed. Gaddafi survived, and the world's reaction landed almost entirely on the American side of the ledger. The UN General Assembly vote was 79 to 28, condemning the United States, with 33 abstentions. Britain voted against the resolution. Thatcher held firm, the one European leader who'd staked her credibility on the operation. France voted to condemn. Spain and Italy followed. The same Italy that had leaked the strike timeline voted to condemn the strike it had compromised. West Germany abstained, which in diplomatic language meant they wanted to condemn, but couldn't quite bring themselves to alienate Washington completely. The Soviet Union introduced a separate Security Council resolution demanding reparations for Libya. Britain and France both vetoed it, which tells you something about the difference between General Assembly theater and Security Council reality. Margaret Thatcher took the hardest domestic hit of any Allied leader. The Labour opposition hammered her for weeks. Polls showed a majority of British voters opposed the decision to allow American aircraft to use British bases. She didn't flinch and didn't apologize. In a parliamentary session that got heated enough to make the evening news, she said the choice was between doing something about terrorism and wringing your hands about it. She chose doing something. Reagan held a press conference the following day. He was calm and measured, entirely unapologetic. American lives had been lost to Libyan-sponsored terrorism. America had responded. He expressed regret for civilian casualties without accepting blame for them. The poll numbers told a split story. Domestically, a majority of Americans supported the raid. Internationally, the United States stood more isolated on the terrorism question than it had been before the bombs fell. 2 pilots were dead. Gaddafi was alive. The mission had worked exactly as designed and failed in the one way that mattered most. Did it work? The honest answer requires you to define work. If the metric is whether Muammar Gaddafi stopped sponsoring terrorism after American bombs cratered his compound, the answer is no. Emphatically, measurably, no. On December 21, 1988, 2 years and 8 months after El Dorado Canyon, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. 270 people died. Libyan intelligence operatives planted the bomb. The investigation took years, but the evidence trail led directly to Tripoli, to agents operating under Gaddafi's authority. 9 months after Lockerbie, UTA Flight 772 was destroyed over the Sahara by another Libyan bomb. 170 dead, French citizens mostly. You could argue the raid made things worse. That Gaddafi, humiliated on the world stage, his compound in ruins, his credibility as a revolutionary leader suddenly dependent on proving he hadn't been cowed, escalated precisely because the bombs fell. CIA analysts at the time were split on this question. Several internal assessments used the word emboldened. A competing view held that Gaddafi would have continued sponsoring attacks regardless, and that the raid at least disrupted his operational infrastructure enough to delay what was coming. The Reagan administration claimed a different metric entirely. Weinberger wrote in his memoir that Libyan-sponsored terrorism dropped significantly in the months immediately following the raid. State Department records partially support this. There was a measurable lull in Libyan-linked operations through late '86 and most of '87. Gaddafi pulled back from direct confrontation with American targets in Europe. His intelligence services went quieter, more careful, harder to track, more willing to use cutouts. Then Lockerbie happened, and the lull looked less like deterrence and more like planning time. So, the scorecard depends on your timeline. Short term, the raid disrupted Libyan operations and demonstrated American willingness to project force at extraordinary range against a state sponsor of terrorism. No country had done anything comparable. The operational achievement was real, and every government that had flirted with sponsoring terrorism understood what it meant. Long-term, Gaddafi killed 270 people over a Scottish village and faced no military consequence for it whatsoever. The American response to Lockerbie was diplomatic and legal and economic. Sanctions, indictments, UN resolutions, years of slow pressure. Effective eventually. But nobody sent F-111s. 4:38 a.m., April 15, 1986. Captain Ribas Domenici's F-111 hits the water at something close to 500 knots. 8:32 p.m., December 21, 1988. The cockpit of Pan Am 103 separates from the fuselage at 31,000 feet over Lockerbie. Between those two timestamps, 981 days, the United States proved it could reach anywhere on Earth with precision munitions, and then watched that proof mean nothing. The assumption was simple. Punish a state sponsor of terrorism so dramatically and so precisely that the sponsor recalculates. The strike itself becomes the deterrent. You don't need to occupy territory or sustain a campaign. You just need to demonstrate capability and will in a single overwhelming night. The rubble sends the message. Gaddafi received the message. He read it differently than intended. His intelligence services spent those 981 days building the bomb that brought down Pan Am 103. A Semtex charge, smaller than a paperback book, hidden inside a Toshiba cassette player, routed through Malta and Frankfurt onto a feeder flight to Heathrow, then transferred to the 747. The technical sophistication wasn't in the explosive, it was in the logistics chain, the cutouts, the baggage transfers, the timing. Gaddafi had learned from the raid, not the lesson Washington intended. He learned to be indirect, to use intelligence tradecraft instead of the Abu Nidal organization, to make attribution slow enough that by the time anyone could prove Libyan involvement, the political window for military retaliation would be closed. 259 people on the aircraft, 11 residents of Lockerbie, killed in their homes by falling wreckage and burning fuel. The youngest passenger was 2 months old. America would reach for this same lever again. Cruise missiles into Afghanistan and Sudan after the embassy bombings in '98. Shock and awe over Baghdad in 2003. The idea that sufficient precision applied with sufficient force at sufficient distance from American soil could reshape political reality on the ground. The strikes always worked. The aftermaths never did. El Dorado Canyon was the template. 18 aircraft, 6,400 miles, 13 hours, a target set destroyed in 11 minutes. The flying was extraordinary, and the tanker work no less so. The crews who pressed through barrage fire at 500 feet in the dark performed beyond what training reasonably prepares a person for. Captain Ribas Domenici and Captain Lawrence are still in the Mediterranean. Their remains were never recovered. The mission they died executing was a masterpiece of operational planning that answered a tactical question nobody had asked, whether America could hit Libya while ignoring the strategic one that actually mattered. Whether hitting Libya would change anything. The wing sweep actuator housing is still visible on tail number 70023, even under 30 years of Arizona sun. The paint has gone from Southeast Asia green to a kind of chalky sage. Sand has pitted the canopy until it's nearly opaque. The variable geometry wing, the whole engineering reason the F-111 existed, the feature that made it the most controversial airframe of the 1960s, is pinned in the full forward position, 68 degrees, the configuration for slow flight and landing. Somebody parked it that way at Davis-Monthan in 1996 and walked away, row after row of them out there. Hundreds of airframes baking in the Sonoran Desert, wingtip to wingtip, arranged with the geometric precision that the Air Force brings to everything including disposal. The boneyard at Davis-Monthan covers roughly 2,600 acres. You can see it on commercial satellite imagery. It looks like a circuit board. The F-111F variant, the specific model that flew El Dorado Canyon, was retired from active service in 1996, 10 years after Tripoli. The Air Force replaced it with the F-15E Strike Eagle, which could do the same job with a two-man crew, and didn't need the complex wing sweep mechanism that had driven maintenance chiefs to drink for 3 decades. The Aardvark had always been a maintenance nightmare. 22 hours of wrench time for every hour of flight time, according to one crew chief stationed at RAF Lakenheath in the mid-80s. He called the aircraft a beautiful headache. The Australians kept their F-111Cs flying until 2010, which says something about the airframe's fundamental soundness, and at least as much about Australian stubbornness. Gaddafi outlasted the airplane that bombed him. He was still running Libya when the last aardvark flew its final sortie. By September 11, 2001, he was still in power, and the entire American calculus about state-sponsored terrorism shifted so violently that everything before it, the Gulf of Sidra, the Berlin Disco, El Dorado Canyon, suddenly looked small. Gaddafi read that shift correctly. By 2003, he was dismantling his weapons programs and handing nuclear centrifuge components to American inspectors. By 2004, he was shaking hands with Tony Blair in a tent outside Tripoli. The rehabilitation took 17 years, 2 airline bombings, and roughly $3 billion in compensation payments to victims' families. Then, the Arab Spring came, and none of it mattered. NATO aircraft hit Tripoli again in 2011. Different airplanes, different president, French Rafales and British Tornadoes this time, with American support. Gaddafi died in a drainage culvert outside Sirte on October 20, 2011, beaten by a mob. The video circulated online within hours. 25 years after American laser-guided bombs missed him by 2 hours and an Italian phone call, he ended up in a concrete pipe in the desert. The Bab al-Azizia compound, the same compound the F-111s struck in '86, was overrun by Libyan rebels in August 2011. They found tunnels underneath it, living quarters, communications equipment, storage rooms, escape routes. The compound had been rebuilt after the American raid, then expanded and fortified further. Gaddafi had been preparing for the next attack for 25 years. When it finally came, it wasn't bombs through the roof. It was his own people coming through the gate. 70023 sits in row 14 at Davis-Monthan, between a stripped F-111A and what appears to be an EF-111 Raven electronic warfare variant with both engines removed. The desert preservation environment keeps corrosion minimal. The Air Force maintains the boneyard as a parts repository, not a museum, so there are no placards explaining where individual aircraft served or what missions they flew. The tail codes have faded enough that you'd need the serial number registry to confirm which squadron this one belonged to, whether it flew that night, whether its PEV-TAC pod tracked a target in Tripoli or Benghazi, or whether it was one of the 6 that